Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today we examine 2378 Sutter Street at Divisadero, San Francisco, 1929. This is a chapter about resilience. Fresh off of a discouraging trip to New York, William was feeling hopeless about his dream to become a writer. What happened in New York? Subsequent chapters go more in depth here, but Saroyan did not strike fame and fortune at this time in New York. He writes, "I was in no mood to take anything seriously, for I considered my 4 months in New York a total failure, and my return to the large, long, unfurnished flat on the 3rd floor at 2378 Sutter Street in San Francisco an event of embarrassment. For I had set out in late August of 1928 by Greyhound bus in the expectation of never going back to the comfortable, purposeless, quarrelsome, impossible life at home." This picture is obviously modern, but it is the same building. Maybe black and white helps the mood. Even though this chapter takes place in San Francisco, it's really about New York. He went to New York to announce himself as a great writer, and New York did not embrace him. Now, at his flat on Sutter Street, he was relieved of that expectation and the pressure to write something life-changing, so he could go back to writing for pleasure. The quarrelsome, impossible life at home may have referred to his mother's frustration with his insistence on staying home and writing instead of looking for work like other young men. A practical woman, she wanted him to be financially secure in a way she understood, as a wage worker or a businessman, like her brother Aram and other men in the family who were financially stable. This was a sore spot between mother and son until he achieved success as a writer. In Here Comes There Goes You Know Who, he writes about this period of his life. "Now, when you're 20, when you're 3,333 miles from home, when you're a writer who hasn't made his fame and fortune, when it's snowing all the time, and 6 million people are knocking themselves out trying to get through the slush on the sidewalk to a cup of coffee, you stop to think. You think, at this rate, I'll never make my fame and fortune. I'm 20 years old. I've been in New York 3.5 months, and I still haven't written a famous book. In less than 2 weeks, it will be 1929, and what good will that do me? Still unknown." He came down with a flu in December 1928, and then felt homesick. Saroyan is restless at age 20. He questions where home is. Fresno, San Francisco, Oakland, the ancestral pole of New York, or Bitlis? Well, perhaps it was a little of each of the places where we had lived, but it was probably something else too. It was probably us, a family, a continuous and difficult, if not frequently impossible, state of being together, all of us in the same place. The food and the sitting together to eat it, or more frequently, sitting to eat it whenever one or another of us got home from work or got up in the morning, some earlier than others. The rooms where our tables and chairs were, the beds, the order of coverings we slept under, wool from the old country, beaten until light, and sewed into thick blankets. Who understands home? Who understands himself? Back in chapter 3, Henry is challenging William to get out of his malaise. Trying to change the subject, William suggests he and Henry walk to the Fillmore and then the public library. Saroyan has many stories about the importance of libraries in his life, and writes an entire love note to the library in The Human Comedy, both the book and the film. It's an escape. Wherever he lived, he gravitated toward the library, including in Fresno, New York, and even when he briefly lived in a rooming house in LA behind the library in 1926. The Golden Gate Valley branch pictured here is probably the library that he walked to from Sutter Street. In this small scene with Henry, He can't bear to think about the boring life of the path most taken. Looking out his window at nearby Mount Zion Hospital, he imagines marrying a nurse, settling down to a predictable life that his mother expects of him. So instead, they walk to Fillmore and the library. 2378 Sutter is one of several different homes that the Saroyan family lived in San Francisco. The building was built in 1900 and is now part of the UC San Francisco Medical Center. This neighborhood is called the Western Addition, even though it's considered pretty central in modern San Francisco. In the mid-1800s, it was part of the westward expansion of the city. The neighborhood mostly escaped the destruction of the famous 1906 earthquake, and most of the city, including City Hall and major stores, moved to the Western Addition after the earthquake and subsequent fire, turning a sleepy neighborhood into a densely packed hub of activity. Fillmore Street, or the Fillmore District, is part of this neighborhood and was an exciting street filled with dance halls, theaters, music, entertainment. The Western Addition was a cultural crossroads with substantial Japanese, Filipino, Mexican, Jewish, and Russian communities. After the earthquake, America's first Japantown was established in San Francisco, in this neighborhood. This part of the city was less upscale than others, and became an enclave for new immigrants. It was called a West Coast version of New York's Lower East Side. Saroyan's early writing centered on San Francisco as a city of immigrants, and the neighborhood he lived in clearly inspired him after the letdown of New York. After World War II, the migration of black shipbuilders brought a huge jazz scene to the Fillmore, giving it the nickname the Harlem of the West. As you can see, New York loomed large in the American imagination of the early 20th century. When this story takes place, San Francisco had begun redlining districts, which meant that federal housing agencies identified areas where banks should not back mortgages in an effort to prevent immigrants, black people, and the, quote, lower grade population from buying houses. Over time, the city neglected the neighborhood simply because of who lived there, and its buildings and quality of life deteriorated. A redevelopment plan in the mid-20th century was considered disastrous, and is part of the reason why San Francisco rejects new and denser development today, a contentious topic for a region with sky-high housing costs. In 1929, when William did briefly find work again in San Francisco, it didn't last long. The family soon moved to Carl Street nearby, where Saroyan would release his breakthrough stories. Saroyan had to pick himself back up many times in his life, from the orphanage in Oakland to the sleepless nights working as a kid in Fresno, and at every point where circumstances or discouragement got in the way of realizing his dreams. In New York, when he lost the money and his luggage, he immediately found a job at the Postal Telegraph Office, waking up at 5 a.m. to open the branch at 6 a.m. He responds to Henry's somewhat paternalistic advice to get up early to go to the employment agency with the smug response that he was used to waking up at 4 a.m. in New York. Living alone in New York, he had left boyhood and entered adulthood. Let's put this place on the Saroyan map and move on.